Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and before I introduce my guest, I have one announcement. I think this event is on the calendar, but as we go through tonight's show, some of you might be interested in participating in this one. Every third Thursday, All Souls UU congregation has a community conversation on race. And this Thursday, they'll have a discussion led by David Gonzalez-Rice. That's at All Souls at 7 p.m. And it's it's over on J Street in New London. So open to the public, feel free to go and join in. So my guest today is attorney Peter Goselin. He is a member of the National Lawyers Guild, and his areas of expertise are workers' rights, immigrant rights, and freedom of speech, wherever you may be. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Rana.
And I had asked him specifically to come because it's become such a hot-button issue. Immigrants coming to the United States in general, and more specifically lately, the refugee crisis and how is the United States going to respond. So I thought Peter could lend some insight on both of those. Lately we've seen a lot of backlash, if you read comment sections and, online or letters to the editor in newspapers, a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. Why?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you, I don't read the comment sections. I try not to get lured into them. I think it's a wise decision. They are not exactly a reflective space. But there's a tremendous amount of anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-refugee rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric in the country right now, to such a level that I think, it's really kind of shocking and scaring a lot of people too. When I see something like this, and it reminds me a lot of the discussions that were going on around immigrants coming to the United States around 2004, 2005, 2006, we see a lot of the same things, that we have a lot of folks who are scared. Now, they're not really scared of immigrants. They don't really know anything about immigrants. They're not really scared of Muslims. They don't know anything about Muslims. They have never met one. What they're really scared of is that we're living in a country where all the things that they believed were going to happen in their lifetime have disappeared. They are not going to retire at age 65 because their pension won't allow them to live on it. They may not be able to send their kids to college because even the University of Connecticut, a public school, is so expensive that many working class people can't afford to go there.
And if they do, they graduate with an incredible debt load.
With an incredible debt load that leaves them living at home.
That's true, and maybe not able to get a job.
And in this economy, certainly not able to get the kind of job that they need in order to pay off that debt. So, those things, the reality of job loss and job insecurity. There was a time when folks from our generation grew up thinking that, we're going to have the same job our whole adult lives. Everyone knows that's out the window. That's no longer the case. So I think people are really afraid of a lot of changes that are going on in society. They feel a tremendous amount of insecurity. And frankly, and this is kind of sad, but I think it is human nature. When you have a choice between thinking hard about something and perhaps having to take on an opponent that's bigger than you and tougher than you, versus not having to think at all and being able to pick on somebody smaller than you and more vulnerable, well, we know which way people are often inclined to go. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. I think a lot of people have found an easy target for a tremendous amount of angst and insecurity and feelings of fear about the future.
And it doesn't logically follow to, victimize people who are lower than you are. But I think it makes sense. Very often, the argument I've heard against welcoming refugees, against welcoming immigrants, is we have homeless people here we're not taking care of. We have veterans here, we're not taking care of them. Why should we welcome new people in when we're not taking care of the people who are already here?
And there are two really, really strange things about that argument. For the first thing, which is just a bizarre irony, and it goes to show how non-rational this thought pattern really is. Most of the politicians who are right now the fiercest flag wavers, the ones that are telling you that, you know, we have to be suspicious of Muslims, we have to be suspicious of foreigners, are also the same people who consistently vote against more benefits for veterans. They're the ones who vote against programs that would help homeless people. They're the ones who vote, for that matter, against programs that help most working people. Increases in Social Security? No, they're not for that. So these are the folks who are, these are the folks who are suddenly getting support because of their opposition to Muslims. And part of that discussion is this notion that we should choose who we're going to help. So I think that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is I don't see any evidence that we can't do both of these things at once. And on the simplest level, I think it's pretty clear that we have the resources, even to a large extent, even the way things are structured now. We have the resources because ultimately investing in immigrants, investing in refugees settling in the United States actually helps our economy. I mean, that's a statistical, it's an economic fact. It's not even up for serious discussion. The net impact of immigration and refugee settlement in the United States is positive for our economy. So even from where things are right now, it doesn't really make sense for someone to say we're going to, we're against this because it's going to hurt our country. But on top of that, if we're asked this question of, well, how are we going to pay for it? The answer is really kind of looking us in the face. The fact of the matter is that more than half of the United States budget maintains a massive war machine with military bases and armed forces all over the world. And if we were to focus on defending our own country, instead of trying to defend every piece of territory where a US corporation happens to want to be in the marketplace, then we would be able to do that at a tiny fraction of the cost. And the billions of dollars that are being spent on military programs could not only take care of the homeless, not only take care of veterans, not only take care of refugees, but could actually improve the standards of living for millions and millions of working people in this country.
I know recently there's building a new plane that is going to cost $3 trillion. And I mean, that's a lot of wealth to spread around. That's, a big part of the, it's certainly much bigger than the New London, budget of all the New London County towns, I'm sure.
Well, and if the money was going to get spread around, I mean, that would be at least one argument for it. But it doesn't. It goes into the coffers of big corporations, who pay for lobbyists, who buy politicians, who then, vote to support these kinds of programs. It's not about defending America or keeping it safe or keeping it safer. It's about what's going to make a lot of money for the corporations that are building these weapons, that are building this arsenal, and the very, very direct impact of spending billions, spending trillions of dollars on a weapons program. It's not an exaggeration to say it's literally taking the food out of people's mouths.
And in Southeast Connecticut, we see a lot of this because so many of the jobs are tied to the military-industrial complex, and yet it's been very resistant to diversification. I'm not sure why, and I'm sure it wouldn't be a huge impact if the defense plants shut down all at once, but I'm not sure why we're not doing a better job of decentralizing our jobs away from the military.
Well, or why we're not capable of taking this industrial infrastructure and using it for things that are necessary.
True.
Things that will actually benefit people, and not kill them.
Right, and I think there are so many things we import, like train cars, all kinds of buses. There are a lot of things we need, and we are importing them, and we do have the manufacturing infrastructure in place. But I think it was the late 80s when Electric Boat downsized quite a bit. And I remember hearing the CEO, he was asked something about diversifying, and he basically said, we only understand cost plus manufacturing.
And really, the other thing that they understand is the next quarterly report to the stockholders. And I think this is something we have to understand really is a change in American capitalism. I mean, during the last couple of decades, we have seen a very significant shift in terms of how corporations operate and what they do with their profits. And that has really been a shift towards an immediate gratification for stockholders. Instead of saying, let's build a corporation that is going to last for a century, you have CEOs and other high-level people coming in saying, let's build a corporation that'll give us a couple of quarters of really extraordinary profits, and then we'll move along, and the stockholders will invest their money someplace else. And the train wreck that's left behind, we're not so much worried about that.
Wow. But I think it's about been in that same time frame that worker productivity has not been matched with rising wages.
Oh, nothing like. Productivity of American workers continues to rise, and yet wages are largely stagnant. There are some studies that show that for all intents and purposes, the wages of American workers have really not risen significantly, the average American worker, since the 1970s. If you think about that, and incidentally, that's also paralleled by the fact that it's around that period, 1970s, that the minimum wage in the United States stopped tracking the increase in cost of living. And if I could just actually sort of talk about that for just a minute, because I think it has a lot to do, obviously the minimum wage has a lot to do with what the maximum wage is. It has to do with what everybody's wages are, because it sets the floor. So if you think about the idea that in 1937, when President Roosevelt passed a bill called the Fair Labor Standards Act that set the first national minimum wage and overtime laws, at that time Congress said, and the President said, the purpose of this minimum wage law is to create a living wage. The idea was anyone who works full-time in a job should be able to live off of it and be able to raise a family on it.
And I'm sure the viewers out there are thinking, you can't live on the minimum wage here and now.
Oh,
nothing close.
Not even remotely. There actually isn't a state in the United States where a worker could care for themselves and a partner and 2 children on the minimum wage, working in a regular full-time job. There isn't a place in the United States where that by itself would be adequate. So really we're talking about people cobbling together several part-time jobs. If there's a couple and they have kids, both of them are working. They're both working more than full-time in a lot of instances. But, it's because that minimum wage has become divorced from the actual standard of living. When we're talking about the idea of a living wage, it's the notion that if you work full-time, you ought to be able to afford the basic necessities. And minimum wage doesn't even begin to provide that. And that's even putting aside, and this sort of relates to what I was talking about earlier, that's even not addressing the fact that minimum wage jobs typically have very few, if any, benefits attached to them, which means that when you're working in a minimum wage job, you're not preparing for your retirement. You're going to have nothing to rely on in your old age other than whatever you can get from Social Security. You are not going to be able to afford health insurance, which means that you're going to end up...
So one health crisis could wipe you out.
Exactly. Any crisis of any kind could wipe you out. I think that an awful lot of working people who are doing a little bit better may find it hard to imagine that losing a part-time job at McDonald's could literally ruin somebody's life. But that's a fact. When you're relying on several part-time jobs just in order to make ends meet, all of a sudden losing 10 hours of work, 15 hours of work at minimum wage can have a really devastating impact. Not being able to work for 2 weeks in a job where there is no provision that you be kept on the books or that you get sick time, where you're working three different part-time jobs, 3 low-wage jobs, retail jobs, fast food, working in a nursing home, whatever, and you get sick or you're in a car accident, you can't work for a month. There's a good likelihood that that's going to mean that when you finally get better, you're going to be out there looking for jobs. You're going to be out there trying to find any job to get by on. And when we have such a low minimum wage, it means that everyone's headed for whatever it is that they can get, because that's what they have to do in order to survive. And of course, it also sets the stage for employers who say, oh, well, you know what? If I know that my workforce is especially vulnerable, well, if the minimum wage, for example, in Connecticut, $9.15 an hour, if the minimum wage is $9.15, I bet I can get workers to work for $8. As long as I don't get caught, that's not a problem for me, because they'll happily work for $8. They'll cut each other's throats for $8 an hour, because that's the marketplace that we're in right now. Because people are desperate for any kind of job that they can get. So it creates a tremendous incentive for unscrupulous employers who want to have an unfair advantage over their competitors by undercutting the labor market and violating labor laws. And unless they're caught, their profits could literally be the profits that come from cheating their workers.
And so hopefully the workers will come to you, right?
Well, as a matter of fact, that's a pretty big part of my practice. An awful lot of the folks that I represent are relatively low-wage workers, not all low-wage, but relatively speaking. And an awful lot of them are folks who are targeted as vulnerable by their employers. And the employers have decided, we don't have to follow the law. We don't have to pay overtime. We don't have to pay a minimum wage. There are employers in some industries, particularly seasonal industries, where the employer says, well, I'll hire 20 people. They'll work for me this season. And if I don't pay them for the last month that they work, any of them, well, then that's a month's wages I've saved. And it's okay, because after that season, I'll fire them. And next season, I'll hire a different group of 20 workers. And I'll do the same thing to them. So we're really talking about companies who actually exist only because of their ability to break the law and get away with cheating workers. So yeah, in fact, those are a lot of the folks that come to me.
Now, I think we've kind of established that the big problems are not coming from the immigrants. They're coming from the people here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about life for immigrants and some of the real problems they face.
Well, certainly at this moment, and of course it's not just immigrants, it's, at this moment, anyone who is perceived to be Middle Eastern or Muslim the United States is a dangerous place right now. Every day you read stories about people who are being assaulted by people who they thought were their neighbors, people who they have no reason to fear or be suspicious of, for no other reason than the way that they look, the way that they dress, their religion, the language that they speak. And some of these stories, I think one of the things that when you hear a story about a woman being attacked in the supermarket because she's wearing hijab, because she's wearing a headdress, or a teenage girl being attacked and beaten up in her high school because of the way that she's dressed, there is no part of the discussion about the pros and cons of refugees in the United States, or how diverse we want to be, or how much tolerance we want to have for other religions or lifestyles. To the extent that we can have a rational discussion about any of those things, there's nothing in that discussion that makes room for beating people up for no other reason than because you don't like the way that they look. And the fact that we're seeing that now, and that we're seeing an atmosphere in which it's tolerated, and in fact in which some people in positions of power, in positions of celebrity, are actually encouraging people to do things like that. That's a pretty scary thing.
And we're seeing in police departments too that there's uneven enforcement. And we've heard scary stories about people who called police to help them, and it went awry.
There really can't be a serious question at this point. To the extent that any of us who are, any white, working class, middle class Americans, to the extent that we had any doubts about how race and ethnicity impacts policing, that should have disappeared some time ago, because every day we see videotapes and news accounts of, in particular, African American people, but young Latino people, Muslims, people being assaulted by police officers in a way that has nothing at all to do with law enforcement. It has nothing at all to do with making communities safe. It has nothing at all to do with I don't know, anything except for the egos and the bullying tactics of police officers. And it's so frequent and so constant, and so it appears to be so much the norm that it certainly leads us to think this isn't an accident, and it's not something that is happening only because of Black Lives Matter or because of the fact that black people are protesting. It's happening because police officers are being trained to view some members of the community as if they were the enemy instead of as if they were the community. So that's a pretty horrifying reality now too, yes.
Well, I'm thinking, I'm Jewish, and at some point I probably would not have been considered white in some times and some places. So I kind of feel it personally that you never really know what group is going to be targeted. But one of the other thoughts I had was that you were talking about fear of lifestyle changes. I'm thinking that a lot of white males who still have privilege, but in the past had more unquestioned privilege, I guess, feeling really oppressed because people want them to be equal and not above.
Well, someone said recently, and I'm not sure who it was, that I should give proper credit for it, but they said that that when one has been living with privilege, the disappearance of privilege, in other words, equality, feels like oppression. And we know that statistically, there are all kinds of polls recently that show that an enormous number of white Americans believe that they are more discriminated against than people of color. We know that statistically, by every reasonable marker, that that's not true. When we're talking about access to jobs, access to education, how the police treat people, how they're treated in the judicial system,
what kind of wages they make?
What kind of wages they make, how they're treated by medical professionals. There are studies on that. There just literally isn't any factual support for the notion that as a group, white people are somehow worse off than people of color in the United States. But the perception and the feeling that that might be the case, I think reflects the fact that an awful lot of white folks take a look at the world around them and they say, what happened to the American dream that we believed that we were promised? And I don't think that's a bad question for them to ask, because it was certainly a lot better than continuing to believe that the United States is going to provide them with that kind of dream, because it's not. I mean, we know that. We see that every day. But it's not a bad question to ask, why are we not getting it? But it's certainly illogical to think that people who have less power than you in society are the ones who are responsible for taking away your privilege, or that you, for that matter, are entitled to it, that you ought to have that privilege as compared to other people. I think it really is the case that more and more white Americans in the workplace and in terms of important institutions like government and healthcare and education actually have much less privilege than they had previously. And they are experiencing that as oppression and reacting to it as oppression, when really it's just, hey, this is what it's been like for black people in the United States forever. It's never been a good deal for them. It's never been a great society. It's never been any of the things that we as white people grew up believing was just part of America.
And so you have the fear coming from that instead of a reflective response, like what really is happening here. Back to immigrants, you mentioned that return on investment in immigrants is actually pretty high. But I wanted to ask you a little bit, you've worked with a lot of immigrants, why do they come here? Is it to take our stuff?
Yeah, one of the strangest theories about immigrants and refugees is that they're all coming here as part of some kind of a grand plot or a conspiracy to take things away from us. And I think someone said recently, Benedict Cumberbatch, the British actor, gives this tremendous speech at the close of every performance. He's in a production of Hamlet in London. He gives this tremendous speech where he says, among other things, no one puts their child in a boat unless being on the water is safer than being on the land. And when we're talking about the refugee crisis, that's exactly what's happening. People are making the decision to engage in desperate voyages to really put themselves and their families' lives on the line for the mere possibility of something that is a little bit better than what they have right now, because what they have right now is so frighteningly intolerable and so deadly, and that they literally feel they have no choice. And it's so strange because, as Americans, we love to watch movies in which there is an underdog. The guy who gets unjustly sent to prison, the woman who's fighting the tough odds because she's a single mother trying to raise children and she can't get a decent job. We love stories about underdogs. These are the real underdogs. These people are folks who are fleeing incredibly horrible circumstances. And, nothing could possibly be more American than to want to say, no, absolutely, we want to be able to help you out. We want to be the good guys in this story. But I think, and I think this is probably part of what you were asking, when we're talking about the horrible conditions that they're fleeing, it does behoove Americans to stop for a minute and think about the fact that the United States government caused a lot of those conditions. That when we're talking about Iraq, Syria, and Libya, for example, and Afghanistan and Pakistan as well, Yemen, the United States has played a both direct and indirect role in devastating these countries. It's strange to me to think that there are young people growing up, college-age kids, who aren't aware of the fact that Iraq was a industrialized, largely secular society before the first Gulf War, that it was a powerhouse, really an industrial powerhouse in a lot of respects.
There's a lot of gender equity there too, compared to most of the Middle Eastern countries.
Right, and when, ironically, when folks who are anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim in particular start talking about how Islam, doesn't treat women well, the countries that were predominantly Muslim that did treat women well are precisely the ones that the United States has really devastated. And the ones that treat women the worst, like in particular Saudi Arabia, are the ones that the United States continues to bankroll. So our foreign policy can't really be based on the idea that we want to protect Muslim women. And of course, not only can't our foreign policy be based on that, but a movement that allows people to beat up young Muslim women in high schools or Muslim women in supermarkets certainly can't be based on the idea that, oh, the problem is we want to make sure that, we think that Muslim women should be treated better. So that's crazy. But the United States plays a very direct role in devastating these countries, creates chaos, and people flee. And then we say, oh, no, we don't want any part of this. Well, we already have a part of it. We're already playing a leading role in the process of devastating these regions. That's true in Mexico and Central America and Latin America, as well as in North Africa and the Middle East. The United States, the places where we see all these immigrants coming from, they are fleeing bad conditions that were, to a large extent, were created by the U.S. military, by the U.S. political establishment, and by U.S. corporations.
And I can't help but think that a lot of this intervention that the United States has done all over the world has been very expensive to the taxpayers, and perhaps one of the reasons why we seem to not be able to afford universal health care or better jobs or, living wages.
Well, yeah, there's no question. It's the investments in these foreign interventions, these military campaigns have been incredibly costly for the American people. They have created an enormous amount of devastation, and in addition to that, they've been incredibly costly for the Americans who, believing that they are serving their country, have gone abroad to fight in these adventures. The men and women who come back traumatized or disabled as a result of the things that they've seen, the things that the United States government is having them actively participate in. The suicide rates among veterans and active duty soldiers are through the roof. The extent of post-traumatic stress disorder diagnoses among both active duty soldiers as well as veterans, through the roof. The United States isn't providing care for these people, it's not providing treatment, but much worse than that, it is continuing the policies that are going to create generation after generation of traumatized veterans. And
we still have traumatized veterans that we should be caring for from Vietnam.
Oh, of course. In the 1970s, around the close of the Vietnam War, it's not coincidental that that was the point at which states like California, where Ronald Reagan was the governor at that time, began deinstitutionalizing the mental health system and turning people out onto the street, because the system was becoming overwhelmed by veterans coming back from Vietnam with PTSD, with serious problems of drug and alcohol addiction, with suicidal tendencies, with all sorts of things, of conditions that were directly the result of being a participant in these horrific wars. And when they came back and needed help, the United States government didn't provide it to them. And there's a significant part of our homeless population today that is a direct product of that war.
Well, you mentioned when you were talking about employment that there's very short-term thinking involved, and it seems as though we're seeing the same sort of short-term thinking when we look at military interventions. It's like there's no limit to how much we'll spend to invade someone, but caring for the vets when they come home, well, we don't seem to put that into the equation.
And I think when we look at foreign policy right now in the Middle East in particular, it's really even worse than that, because and I have to say, I think this is a weakness that a lot of us who had been working in the anti-war movement for years, a weakness in our analysis. We believed that what the United States was doing in that region was short-sighted and not the best ways to go about it, and that that was not going to accomplish the goals that the government was setting out. Well, it's true that it wasn't accomplishing those goals, but it was accomplishing the real set of goals. And I think we can see pretty clearly right now, especially after this fiasco in Syria and the fight against ISIS, that all along the real goal of foreign policy has been to destabilize that region, to simply figure out what can we do that will create the greatest amount of chaos, break up existing governments, break up existing borders and boundaries, shuffle them all around until the United States can one way or another, can get control over a particular piece of territory. Now, the getting control hasn't worked nearly as well as the policymakers thought it would, but to a large extent, the U.S. policy in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, has all been based on the idea that the point here is to simply disrupt and create chaos, and then afterwards come in and pick up the pieces.
And I think we're seeing in some of these cases, both sides are fighting with U.S. supplied weapons.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, ISIS is armed to the hilt with U.S. supplied weapons. An awful lot of those weapons came to them by way of organizations that were supposed to fight the Syrian government, that were being funded by the United States. There was a famous famous piece of testimony given by a Pentagon general about the situation in Syria, in which he was asked for some $100 million that was invested in training and arming a rebel group against the Assad government. For that $100 million, what did the United States get? How many fighters were they actually able to train? And his response was about 12. And those are not very good odds. That's a pretty bad return on investment. But I think that we can guess that the corollary to what he's saying is that all of the weapons that were provided, all the training that was provided, all of the other infrastructure that was provided for this rebel group, we know where it ended up. We know it ended up in the hands of ISIS. That's where they got it from. That's why they have the kinds of resources that they have. They got them from the United States, either directly or indirectly, because we are the ones who are saturating the region with weapons of war.
Now, what would a good immigration policy look like? I know, there has been some movement. I think the president committed to our taking 10,000 refugees. But at the same time, there is a lot of very intense screening to keep some people out. So what should our policy look like if we want to bring people in and it becomes a good investment for us?
Well, when we're talking about a good immigration policy, I think that sometimes we're actually asking the wrong question. Here's the question I would like us to ask. I would like us to ask, what's the best way of ensuring that people who want to work hard and succeed have the opportunity to do that in this country, and that based upon their willingness to work hard and succeed, what's the best way to reward them for that? So, an awful lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment always focuses on the idea that, there's no way that we should grant them amnesty, there's no way we should let them get their green cards, et cetera. I think that's completely the wrong approach. I think if you want a healthy citizenry, what you want are people who are willing to work hard. What you want are people who are willing to participate in their communities. And to a large extent, that defines most of the immigrants who come to the United States. We know that statistically, that immigrants coming to the United States are less likely to engage in criminal behavior than native-born people are. We know that, as I said earlier, that these are folks who work hard, save their money, want to get their kids educated, want to participate in the system. So why are we focusing on the idea that citizenship is some elusive goal that should only be attainable by a few, instead of saying, let's reward good citizenship, let's reward hard work, let's reward participation in the community, let's reward commitment to democratic institutions by making people citizens. So that instead of having this notion that there's some kind of a quota, or we're simply going to require that you go to the back of the line and stand there for 10 years until we get around to recognizing you, that instead we just take a look at, well, in the immigrant communities in Connecticut, there are literally tens of thousands of people who are living without papers, who are hardworking people, who are honest people, who are raising good kids, and who are a credit to their community. Those people should be citizens. In fact, when I went to school and they talked to us about citizenship, those were the qualities that they said were good citizenship. So I'm having a hard time understanding why it is that the status of citizen doesn't seem to have anything to do with good citizenship anymore, and that so many people who are proving to be good citizens can't get the papers that recognize that fact.
And it seems like there's an obsession with whether or not they're documented or not.
Oh yeah, the notion that whether or not somebody's carrying a green card or has a social security number, that somehow that's some sort of a valid definition of whether they're a good person or not. For quite a few years, I've been having this argument about the use of the term illegal alien. And one of the reasons that I tell people over and over again, that they say, oh, it's just political correctness. Like, no, you know what? First of all, the term illegal alien is grammatically meaningless. When someone puts a porch on their house without getting local zoning approval, nobody calls them an illegal taxpayer or an illegal homeowner. That's terminologically, that doesn't really make any sense. And most of these folks are illegal only in the sense that the system doesn't have the ability to recognize what it is that they're contributing. This obsession with the idea that certain people are illegal, or that being documented or undocumented is an indication of moral quality, it's certainly not borne out by the facts. And it certainly doesn't make sense from a policy point of view. If we want to grow healthy communities here in Connecticut, I think we want all the help we can get. I think we want everybody who wants to work hard, everybody that wants to send their kids to school, everybody that's serious about getting ahead. We want those people to participate, and we should be rewarding them for it.
And two things come to mind. One, it's so ironic because most of us in Connecticut, our families have been here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, but we're not the original residents. And I wouldn't guarantee that all of my ancestors had documentation. I don't know. We don't really know. There are a lot of claims made, oh, my family came over legally, but I don't think most people whose families immigrated in the 19th century really know that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, for one thing, there was a long period of time during which the whole notion of having to have papers in order to be able to enter the country and in order to ultimately become a citizen. I mean, that's a relatively recent phenomenon to start with. So to a large extent, the country was settled by people who didn't have papers. And it's kind of funny because if you think about the idea of is illegal immigrant, is that a logical term? We can certainly say that there was a substantial population, if we wanted to accept the idea that the term makes any sense at all, there's a substantial population that settled the United States who really were illegal immigrants. That is to say, they were people who were being sent here by their countries as punishment for their having committed crimes. There are significant parts of the United States that were settled by criminals and convicts. For us to take a high hand at this point and say, oh, well, just because these people want to work hard and be upstanding citizens, that doesn't mean that they should be allowed in or that they should be allowed formal status. We who are the children of various despised minorities in our home countries, somehow we're entitled to that privilege and these people are not.
And certainly the Italians in Connecticut went through this 100 years ago. They were a despised minority.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. we were talking about this a little bit before the show, that Catholics in general, now Connecticut is a very Catholic state. This part of the country is a very Catholic part of the country. And I think it really behooves a lot of folks out there who are thinking about the issue of immigration and refugees, and especially thinking about the problem of how we view and how we treat Muslims. It really behooves us to take a look at that history. There was a period in time in which Catholics were extremely suspect in this country, precisely because of the belief, which of course was false, that Catholics couldn't be good Americans because they first of all had an allegiance to the Vatican, and that the Pope would ultimately tell Catholics what they should or should not do, and therefore they could not really be trusted to follow American laws. Now, of course, in addition to that, every one of these minority groups, Italians, Irish, French Canadians, Poles, Jews, all of us were tarred with various kinds of stereotyped views of what we were like. And for most of the Catholic immigrant groups in particular, my family's Irish on one side and French Canadian on the other. So obviously, if those stereotypes were true, we should all be drunks. We should all have 15 or 20 kids, because that's what they said about us. When my family came here, what they said about us is those French Canadians or those Irish, they're Catholics. They just pop out babies like nobody's business. They drink their wages away. They beat their wives. And they're dangerous and criminals, basically.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, and keeping in mind, I guess that Connecticut is a place that's lost population over the last 50 years. What can people do, like any individuals who are watching this, to be allies or to influence what happens in terms of policy about immigrants?
Well, let's see. There's a lot of things that people can do. There's a lot of contributions that they can make, and it starts, I think, at a very personal level. Right now, in the midst of this whole discussion about Muslims in America, I think everybody that's within listening range of my voice has a responsibility, if they have not previously had this experience, to go down to the local mosque in their community and say hi and get to know the people who are members of that local community group, because they're your neighbors. They're really nice people. They are members of your community, and you know what? They're really scared. They're really scared because of the violence that's being perpetrated against members of their group. They're scared because of ISIS, and they're scared because of Trump, and they could really use some friends. So I think that would be number one on my list. Number two on my list would be to participate in local organizations that are trying to bring together, and this is one of the projects that I'm working on right now, trying to bring together folks from the Muslim community and allies with the idea that we all have a common concern, which is this sort of hateful rhetoric that seems to have taken over America. And that together we can actually respond to that, and we can push back, and in a successful way.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Peter. I hope people are motivated. I wanted to make a very quick pitch. Humans of New York has been profiling refugees, and it's kind of a good idea to really hear people's story before we stereotype them or fear them or whatever.
Everybody knows a story from their own family. If they come from a family of immigrants, they know stories about where their people came from. I think people would be astonished at how similar the stories of this current wave of refugees and immigrants, whether they're from Mexico or whether they're from Syria, I think they'd be astonished at how similar those stories really are.
I bet that's true. Well, thank you again, Peter. Next week, Jason Ortiz will be our guest, and he's going to talk about some of his community organizing projects. So we'll see you then, and thank you.
Thank you.
into things